Hey there, this year I did an experiment whether using cannabis waste from the plant, the unharvested part of the plant, is a viable source or resource to be used as a fertilizer on your crops. And here are the results. So, medicinal cannabis production is an important industry for many patients, but at the same time it creates a lot of waste, and that's given by the fact that there are a lot of legal and regulatory issues about cannabis production, given the fact that it contains psychoactive compounds such as THC, which is tetrahydrocannabinol. From pure natural things, when you discard 90% of something that you grew, that doesn't sound right. However, when we then look into the details, for example, this 90% of the plant contains 80% of the macronutrients that the farmer needed to invest or give the plant for it to grow. And when he then harvests only the 10% and discards the other 90%, it sounds unecological. But when we then look at how the industry works, the medical cannabis farms are also highly regulated, not only their waste. So most of the times, in a high percentage, medical cannabis farms are indoor farms, which means it's either a greenhouse or a full-on indoor farm, like closed room. There are high electricity bills, which most of the times is the highest expense of any given operation. Then we have other energy costs, like for the heating, but the main expense is usually the lights. That's another reason why discarding 90% of the cannabis plant doesn't sound right or isn't ecological, because when we invested some amount of electricity or energy from coal, for example, into growing a plant, and we then discard 90% of that investment, it's like burning the coal for nothing. And also, this 90% of the plant contains 80% of macronutrients contained in the plant, or that the plant originally had. So discarding 80% of the macronutrients also isn't right, because if it was a normal operation, like if they were growing tomatoes or something, they could compost the stalks, reuse all the nutrients and the energy that was put into that. But given the regulations, they most of the times they need to discard it into landfills where it just rots and is never used again, or it's incinerated or burned, in simple terms. So the production of medical cannabis is unecological. When you then take it to the global scale, or here represented only the numbers for Europe, 2.5 million plants in 2024 grown in 2024 in Europe, and 11 million plants are expected to be grown here in 2032. It's a big amount of plants, and 90% of that will be discarded. It's not really a fault of the industry, but a collective fault of the industry and the regulators forcing the industry to burn 90% of the plants because of the active compounds in there. And to introduce the radishes, why radishes were used in this study, I like to compare them with Drosophila melanogaster, which is your common fruit fly. And it's a favorite animal or insect in genetics, in the genetics industry or science field, because they grow quick, they reproduce quickly, so the scientists are able to see the results of their genetic alterations quickly, and therefore the research moves quickly. And I chose radishes because they have a relatively short growing period, which should be about 1 month, which was perfect for seeing the results in my bachelor thesis. So the research goal and the hypothesis, the research goal was to compare the efficacy of using plant rests from medical cannabis cultivation with a standard store-bought compost in terms of the effect on the yield of radishes. There are 2 treatments using the cannabis waste differently. One of the treatments was that the cannabis waste was mixed into the soil, and the other treatment was where the cannabis waste was used only as mulch. And there were 4 duplicate hypotheses. We focus on the total yield, total plant count, speed of germination, and effect on microbial soil mass of the different substrates. To get the exact hearing of the hypotheses, hypothesis 1 was the treatment with cannabis plant rest T3, which stands for the treatment 3, will grow the same amount of radishes in terms of weight as T2, which was treatment 2 with compost. H2 was the same, but for treatment 5, comparing the amount of radishes grown with treatment 2. H3 or hypothesis 3 was the treatment with cannabis plant rest T3 will grow the same amount of radishes in terms of plant count as T2, and H4 was the same but with the 5th treatment comparing it with T2. H5 was plants in the treatment with cannabis plant rest T3 will germinate at the same time as in T2. Which was the treatment with compost, and H6 was the same but with T5 and T2. H7 or hypothesis 7 was the microbial soil mass in the cannabis plant rest treatment T3 will be comparable with the one in T2. And H8 was the same but with T5 and comparing the microbial soil mass or the effect on the microbial soil mass of T5 and T2. Then we move on to materials and methods because of the regulatory issues. In my country, the Czech Republic, I could have only used root systems of the plants. It was mother plants 9 months old. I then used store-bought compost. I used store-bought radish seeds. It was grown on a field in Prague, Letňany, on the land of Metro Farm, which is a community garden initiative here in Prague. The experiment was done in 50 planting pots. So the treatments were designed in cooperation with my thesis supervisor. The first treatment was just the control, which was just the soil. A second treatment was soil with compost in a ratio 5:1. Third treatment was soil with the plant rest in a ratio 5:1. Treatment number 4 was soil plus compost plus the plant rest in ratio 5 to 0.5 to 0.5, which means that the 5:1 ratio of soil and the amendments was kept, but the part for the amendments was divided into 2 for the compost and the plant rest. All of these amendments up until now were mixed into the soil, and then comes treatment number 5, which was soil plus the plant rest in a ratio of 5:1. But in this treatment, the plant rests were used only as mulch, so they were just put on top of the soil and left there. The experimental design, it was 5 randomized blocks. Each block contained 10 pots in 2 rows, as you can see on the image. Each row had all 5 treatments present in it, and the way I decided the position of each pot or of each treatment in each row and each block was with a random number generator from Google. As you can see, the pots were numbered, so I just let Google decide a number from 1 to 5 and placed it on the ground. And now we move to the results, the interesting part. So the total growing time was 45 days, even though it should have been 28 to 32 days, as the seed manufacturer stated. However, we'll get back to this later. The results or the radishes weren't in optimal condition, and there is many reasons why that could have happened, but that's also the reason why I left them growing for 45 days, because they were still too small. Even after 45 days, they were still too small. When compared to a normal radish weighs about 5 to 10 grams at least, or in my bachelor thesis there are even higher numbers based on the variety. However, the radishes grown in this experiment, the heaviest radish was 3 grams, which is way below market size. The results for the total weight for all the different treatments were that treatment number 2, yielded the highest weight when all the radishes were weighted in together. The total weight of them without leaves was 20 grams. And on the other side, T1, which was just the soil or the control, yielded the lowest weight, which was 12 grams in total, all the radishes combined in T1, which makes H1 and H2 both false, or hypothesis 1 and 2 false, because they've stated that T3 and T5 respectively will grow the same amount of radishes in terms of weight as T2, which didn't happen because the difference between the weights of T3, T5 and T2 was statistically significant. Then we move on to the total number of plants grown. So T4 here grew the most plants. Funny thing that T2, although it had the highest amount in weight, in total weight, it grew the least plants. Only 12 plants were harvested. This means that H3 and H4, the both hypotheses are proven false, as T3 and T5 grew significantly, statistically significantly more plants than T2. Then we have single plant weight, as I foreshadowed here earlier. T2 had the heaviest plants, and by far, as you can see on the box plots. T1, which was the control, had the lightest or the smallest plants, and T3 with T4 were relatively comparable. Then we get to the germination speed. T5 germinated the earliest, as you can see here, on day 4, the 4 days after planting them. 4 plants from T5 already germinated, which means that H6 was proven false, because it stated that the plants from T5 and T2 will germinate at the same time or at the same speed. T5 was faster. But H5 was proven right, which was that plants from T3 and T2 will germinate at the same time. And that did happen, because on day 6, 5 plants from T2 and exactly 5 plants from T3 did germinate. Then we get to the results of microbial carbon. I measured this with the CFE method, the chloroform fumigation extraction. As we can see, the control T1 had way less microbial carbon than all the other treatments, which is I guess no wonder, because it had no amendments in it. On the other hand, T4 had the most, which was an interesting result. The differences were both statistically insignificant between T2 and T5 and T2 and T3. The amount of microbial mass was comparable. So H7 and H8 are both right. To get to the discussion, T2 grew, in quotes, in air quotes, the best radishes in terms of market preference, because the radishes were simply the biggest from all the other, from all the treatments. And as I said, all treatments failed to grow normal radishes, which means all of them were under market weight values, or even sometimes visual standards. But T2 did get the closest to growing similar radishes as we see in the supermarkets. T4 displayed the best conditions for radish germination. That's something to keep in mind for further usage. And the fact that all treatments failed to grow normal-sized radishes might be due to multiple factors. One factor is that there were 2 storms in total during the course of the experiment, which toppled some of the pods, but I controlled the pods every 2 days, and when I got there wasn't no visible damage, and there weren't even toppled for a prolonged amount of time, only like 24 hours. The sun deprivation, which might have or might have not occurred, I don't think that was the resulting factor. There was only like 1 or 2 pods toppled at a time at each one of those instances, so it definitely didn't have an effect on the whole population. Another thing what might have happened is either sunburn. I concluded in the bachelor thesis that maybe sunburn was the reason, because all of the plants showed some sort of yellowing and some sort of necrosis going on. As you can, for example, here I put an image of T3, which were on all the plants harvested. As you can see, not all the leaves are in perfect and mint condition, and also you can look at the roots. Not all of them even formed the bulb. That's why I was saying that all treatments failed to grow normal radishes. So what we can see here is that some of the leaves are yellowing. Some of the leaves have some minor pest damage on them, I would say, because cannabis has a high lignin content, which is a very hard to break compound or break down compound. It might be better for the future to make biofertilizers out of cannabis with inoculants instead of using cannabis or the plant waste, the plant rest as compost, which was suggested by Olsen et al. in 2024. And another way to use the cannabis plant rest might be to do the compost, but Stalpinate also in 2024 found that when you incorporate the plant rest into soil, provide nitrogen fertilizers, it speeds up the whole process of the lignin breakdown, because it speeds up the breakdown of the lignin. But if only mulch is needed, if the farmer, for example, a no-till farmer, has a hard soil and only wants mulch and doesn't really care about the nutritional values, the cannabis straw works really well, as I believe it was the main reason why the plant in T5 germinated the fastest by far from all the other treatments, because the soil was clayish and relatively hard. And I believe T5 plants germinated the fastest because they were sown only about 1.5 centimeters into the substrate, which was still in the mulch or tiny bit below the mulch, but they still had relatively easier conditions and not that hard of a substrate to push through for germination. Overall, utilizing the cannabis waste in the future in any form would be beneficial to make this industry more ecological and more, I guess, more resourceful and more caring about the environment and the fact or the amount of energy and electricity and nutrients that's put into the plants, that at least a part of that would be reused. Well, this was my presentation of the research, and let me know what you think about my research or the potential uses of the cannabis straw. Yeah, thanks for watching.